Thank you all, and hello and welcome for joining us from all corners of the country. My name is Kelsey Carrier. I'm Senior Project Manager at Park People, and I'm pleased to be your moderator for today's webinar. Just a few technical notes to get us all set up. If you have any questions during today's session, feel free to type them into the chat window, which you'll find by hovering over the bottom of your screen. There's a little dialog box that will bring you into the chat window, and you can ask any questions you would have there. Be sure to click to respond to all panelists and attendees, so you're not just speaking to one or the other or someone in private. So we do encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar. We want this to be as interactive as possible, and we'll also have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar to address all of your concerns or questions and areas of interest. So for those of you who are new to Park People, we are a national charity that helps people activate the power of parks to improve the quality of life in cities across Canada. Our national network program provides comprehensive support tools and inspiration to grassroots community groups, nonprofit organizations, and municipal staff across the country that are working to animate and enhance their local parks. We also facilitate information exchange and peer learning between Canadians, as well as bring innovative city park ideas and projects to life through new partnerships and research. We would like to open today's webinar by acknowledging the land that we are gathered on and expressing our gratitude for its critical connection to the health of all. We also acknowledge the enduring presence and resilience of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people all across this land, and we recognize their role as caregivers, as stewards, and storytellers across Turtle Island. We're honored to be able to gather here today, as we believe that parks should play a vital role in providing shared spaces for all people, and that they are an important space for reconciliation and decolonization work. We invite you to introduce yourself in the chat window with your name, your organization, and what nation's territory you're visiting us from. If you don't know which nation's territory you live or work in, we encourage you to visit Native Land or Whose Land, which are websites which will provide this information to you, which we are including in the chat window right now. And with that, we are excited to welcome you today to the launch of the 2020 Canadian City Parks Report. This report would not have been possible without the generous support of the W. Garfield Weston Foundation, and we would like to say a huge thank you to everyone at the Foundation for supporting this work, not only this year, but for 3 years running. We are already excited about our work coming up with the 2021 report. We also want to thank the RBC Foundation for its support, specifically for the biodiversity stories in the report and the online biodiversity resource library, which we will be adding to over time. We want to thank the Landscape Architecture Canada Foundation for their support of the research into small-scale urban biodiversity, which formed the basis of the Small is Mighty story in this report. And we also wanted to let you know that we will be providing a French language version of this webinar coming up on Wednesday, August 5th, for those of you who might prefer the French language conversation, and also to share that with your colleagues. And with that, I would like to introduce Jake Tobin-Garrett, who is our Manager of Policy and Planning, and Adri Stark, our Project Coordinator for the Canadian City Parks Report.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I also wanted to add a big thanks to everyone that provided time and expertise in creating this report. I know many of you are actually on the webinar right now, including the many staff whose jobs I know are really, incredibly busy. So thank you so much for being a part of this, and to the entire Park People team for their support and guidance, and also to my co-author, Adri Stark, who I could not have done this work without. So the Canadian City Parks Report tracks the trends, challenges, and opportunities in Canadian city parks. And what we've launched is a second edition of the report. So we had our inaugural report last year. And we compiled data and leading practices in 5 theme areas: nature, growth, collaboration, activation, and inclusion. And our goal really with this report is to track progress over time, to support shared learning and inspire new thinking, particularly by spotlighting all Canadian examples and stories. So we hope that the stories and the information that we've included in the report are useful to you. Whether you're a local resident volunteering in a park group, whether you're a park staff person looking for inspiration from across the country, or maybe you're a park professional like a landscape architect, or someone who works at a nonprofit that does stuff with parks like we do. The report also includes city profiles, which is where you'll find data and highlights and plans and strategies for each of the cities in the report. And the report includes 27 cities from 8 different provinces, coast to coast across Canada. And to get the data, we provided each city with a questionnaire. And to choose cities, we reached out to really dozens of cities across the country, and we've tried to ensure a good mix of small to large cities and in different geographic locations. And we really want to add more cities each year. So really, if you don't see your city in the report, please feel free to drop us a line afterwards. It's actually really helpful for us to be able to pass along that information to cities that people have emailed us that they want to see their city in the report. It's really helpful for us to be able to say, people are clamoring for X city to be in the report when we go back to them for next year.
Thanks, Jake. So I wanted to start us off today by sharing some findings of a survey that we conducted last month to learn about the impact of COVID-19 on city parks in Canada. And we conducted 2 versions of this survey. So one was for the public, where we heard from over 1,600 people living in Canadian cities. And one was for municipalities, where we heard from Parks Department representatives in 51 Canadian cities. And what we learned is that parks have played a really vital role in people's lives during the pandemic. So 82% of Canadians said that parks have become more important to their mental health during COVID, and 70% said that parks have become more important to their physical health. And we heard that municipalities are also appreciating the value of parks more than ever. So 94% of cities said that among municipal leadership, they've seen increased recognition of the value of parks to both public health and crisis resiliency. We also learned that despite parks or park amenities being closed during COVID in all of the cities we surveyed, over half of cities reported that they've seen increased park use during the pandemic. And 2/3 of Canadians said that they've been using parks several times a week or more on average. We also found that although almost 9 in 10 Canadians support increased funding to expand and improve parks as part of COVID recovery, park budgets are facing insecurity. So 57% of cities said that COVID-19 is likely to have a negative impact on budgets within the next year. And if you're interested in seeing more of our survey findings, the full results are available on our blog. But what these statistics really highlight is that we're at this critical moment where people are relying on parks more than ever, yet the future of parks is facing uncertainty due to our present economic realities. And thank you so much to TD for making this survey possible. So for the rest of today, we're going to focus on 3 of the major topics that we explore in this year's Canadian City Parks Report. First, we're going to look at the report's special focus area of urban biodiversity, and in particular, the well-being benefits of biodiverse urban spaces, including small-scale ones. And second, we'll explore some of our findings about the growing issue of unsheltered homelessness in parks, and take a look at examples of practices that support the well-being and inclusion of people experiencing homelessness. Last, we're going to look at equitable park development and strategies that sort of reimagine what that looks like in a COVID-19 context.
Thanks, Adri. So as Adri mentioned, the nature section this year includes a big focus on urban biodiversity. And COVID-19 has really highlighted the importance of natural spaces in our city. And yet biodiversity in Canada is under pretty extreme threat due to climate change and processes of urbanization, development and growth. The World Wildlife Fund Canada reported that 50% of monitored Canadian species are actually in decline. And we found in our research that 2/3 of cities reported protecting biodiversity as a top challenge, but only 1 in 5 had a citywide biodiversity strategy in place. So this really suggests to us that there's more work to be done in creating citywide biodiversity strategies that map out ecological networks, both locally and across regions, and propose community engagement and stewardship and programming opportunities. And this is really important because we also found that 70% of cities reported increasing demand for park naturalization projects, and 56% of cities reported increasing demand for natural stewardship programming. So, people in Canadian cities are really hungry for natural experiences in their parks and looking for ways to get involved. go to the next slide. Great. So biodiversity is also incredibly important to our mental health and well-being. And this is the focus of a story in the report called The Feel Good Factor, where we detail new research into this area. And this fact became apparent in the COVID survey results, as Adrian mentioned, where over 80% of people said that parks had become more important to their mental health during COVID-19. So people are really using our parks and our natural spaces as places to relax, to rejuvenate, to distress. And on a personal note, my local parks have become even more important to me in the past few months as places where I can go for a walk after, working at home all day, and shake off, the anxiety that I've been feeling during this time and just sort of recharge a little bit. We already knew, of course, that spending time in nature was good for people's mental health. There's been lots of scientific studies from the 1980s and onwards, and we profile many of them in the report. But what we wanted to look at was whether the mental health benefits are affected by biodiversity levels. So is there a difference between spending time in a park with a grassy lawn and some trees versus spending time in a woodlot or in a meadow? And overall, the research has found that people actually report a greater sense of well-being in areas that they perceive to be more biodiverse. And that factors such as length of time and types of planting play a role. So lots of green plantings cause a different effect on people than when they're in an area that has lots of really bright wildflowers. You can find much of this research that we looked at for this look at biodiversity and well-being in the Biodiversity Resource Library that's compiled on the website. So if you just go to the nature section of the website, there's a tab that's called Biodiversity Resource Library, and there's a whole bunch of really amazing resources there, but there's a section on biodiversity and well-being. So if you're interested, you can kind of read on these studies yourself. But we think this finding has really important implications for how we plan, design, and involve people in biodiversity across the city. So Ryerson University's Nina Marie Lister told us that we need to think about biodiversity as psychological infrastructure as much as we think about it as green infrastructure in our cities. And another researcher, Don Carruthers Den Hode from Mount Royal University, said that using the Canadian Index of Wellbeing as a guide can be really helpful. For example, he said sort of through that index, you can start to evaluate how community stewardship programming is not just about an environmental experience for people, but it can also help support overall community resilience by, that social factor and that sort of mental health and well-being factor. So it's just another lens to look through when we're thinking about the impacts of some of this type of stewardship work. Overall, we heard that cities really need to focus more on integrating and recognizing the well-being benefits of biodiversity in planning and in programming, but also look at who has access to and is included in these spaces in our city. So are natural experiences accessible to everyone in the city? Do people feel safe and included when they visit these spaces? Do people have access to the same quality of natural experiences across a city, or are some places greener or richer in biodiversity than others? And in our review of some of the Canadian biodiversity strategies we looked at for this report, we didn't really find much concrete policy or kind of recommended actions around equity and inclusion. And given the current pandemic context and the mental health benefits of nature and biodiversity specifically, it seems that this would be really important work for cities to undertake. We also looked at the importance of small-scale urban biodiversity. So I think often when we talk to people about nature and biodiversity, we picture kind of large parks at the edges or maybe even outside of cities. But we found that even micro-urban biodiversity projects can have really important benefits both to communities and to the environment. Vanessa Carney from the city of Calgary pointed out that small neighborhood-based biodiversity projects like pollinator gardens can act as important habitat stepping stones, connecting larger nature parks for different kinds of wildlife. But that they also provide important opportunities for people to experience nature in their day-to-day lives. So this could be, a garden, a native plant garden or a pollinator garden on someone's front yard that they've planted, or one in a local park that they're helping to steward. And in the report, we profile how Ottawa has built naturalization guidelines into its park development standards. And cities like Victoria and Fredericton and Halifax are actively naturalizing parts of parks with native plant gardens and pollinator plants specifically, often in collaboration with local communities. And if you go to the Small is Mighty story, there's a really interesting, what Fredericton is doing, I think is really interesting in terms of naturalizing some of the retaining walls in their parks and making these kind of living walls. It's really cool. As I mentioned, there's also an important community aspect to these gardens. Manaz Ghalib, who I saw was watching on today's webinar, she founded the Dallington Pollinators Community Garden, and she said that the social aspect of the garden was really important to the community. It's a place where kids come to learn about different plants and pollinators. They can speak to residents, in the high-rise neighborhood around the garden about what they can be doing maybe on their own balcony. And similarly, Marie-Pierre Bouveau from Les Amis du Champ des Possibles in Montreal said that their naturalized lot that they work in allows people of different ages to come together through learning about plants, but also participating in some of the art-based activities that group has put on. Lastly, we heard that these gardens can be really important places to honor Indigenous land stewardship practices. Jos Tucros Tremblay is a member of the Indigenous Land Stewardship Circle and works with urban Indigenous populations to plant and tend Indigenous species in local parks. And they also research less invasive maintenance practices. And they told us that for urban Indigenous people, these gardens are an important way to stay connected to the land. So Joe said, for the 50% of Indigenous populations that are now living in urban settings, parks are often our only place to connect with the land. A lot of healing happens by just getting your hand in the ground. So just wanted to see better city support for these types of initiatives, including education for management and park maintenance staff on Indigenous stewardship practices and plantings. And as an example, they pointed to an instance when a park maintenance staffer accidentally mowed down their Three Sisters garden in a park as an example of a gap in knowledge that could be filled.
So another topic that we take a close look at in the report is the growing issue of unsheltered homelessness in parks. And through our survey, responding to homelessness was identified by cities as a top challenge, but few responded to our prompt to highlight examples of inclusive work that they do that goes beyond sort of the standard approach of encampment monitoring and clearing. So we know that this is, of course, a really complex issue that can feel outside the expertise of park professionals, but it stood out to us as an area where there are real opportunities to reevaluate and reimagine some of our standard approaches. Before diving into these findings, I want to, of course, acknowledge that the presence of encampments in parks is symptomatic of deeper systemic issues, such as the lack of affordable housing in Canadian cities, growing income inequality and poverty, as well as systemic racism and the effects that has in both our housing markets and our labor markets. And while we realize that ultimately long-term housing solutions and sort of deeper solutions to this issue fall outside the realm of parks, we also recognize that rising homelessness is a reality in many of our Canadian cities, and especially with the hit of COVID to both our economy as well as our shelter systems. So while we know that this topic can feel daunting and maybe even a little bit uncomfortable, we really want to highlight that there are concrete, tangible ways that we can respond to this more equitably, and we can look to examples of that from within Canada. But first, a bit of background context that's important to understand is that encampments can actually be places of relative safety and stability for people. So through speaking with experts like Chrissy Brett, who is an encampment resident and leader in Vancouver, we learned that being surrounded by a community where people can look out for each other is really important. And especially in the context of an opioid crisis, encampments can effectively play the role of an informal overdose prevention site. And during COVID-19, we've seen an even stronger public health argument for allowing people outdoors to remain in place. So authorities, including the Centers for Disease Control in both the US as well as BC, have issued guidance that people living outdoors should be allowed to remain in place to reduce risks of COVID transmission. But we actually found in our own survey last month that only 16% of the 51 cities we surveyed had suspended encampment evictions during COVID-19. So this practice of removing people from parks is expensive for cities in terms of cleanup and enforcement, and it has the effect of shuffling people around in a cycle of displacement that really has no end. So when displaced from parks, people are often pushed into more isolated areas, which breaks connections with service providers, and research shows that this is associated with increased safety risks. Clearing encampments also repeats colonial patterns of dispossessing people from land, and specifically Indigenous people who we know are overrepresented in our homeless populations as a direct result of the ongoing impacts of colonialism and systemic racism. And on top of all of these factors, we also spoke with Anna Cooper of Pivot Legal Society in Vancouver, who pointed out that bylaws that prohibit sheltering in parks have actually been ruled unconstitutional on the grounds that they threaten people's charter rights to safety and security. And in the report, we also examined some of our more indirect practices that might contribute to displacing people from parks, such as defensive design. As a classic example, we can think of a park bench that has a third armrest to prevent people from lying down. And we spoke with researcher Kara Chalou, who defines defensive design as an intentional strategy used to guide people's behavior in public space as a means of crime prevention or order maintenance. But she points out that a lot of the behaviors that defensive design sort of limits or restricts aren't actually criminal. They're sort of just associated with living, like, for example, taking a nap. And she also points out that this approach not only fails to address root problems, it also makes parks inhospitable for everyone. So a lack of benches or a lack of washrooms also serves to exclude seniors or people with chronic health conditions, for example. So we might all be wondering, what are some of the other options? And we found that some are really quite simple. So for one, we heard that it's really important to consult and collaborate with people living in encampments to work towards solutions. One example that we highlight is the work of the Native Woman Shelter in Montreal in a park called Cabot Square. So Cabot Square is a really important gathering place for the Indigenous community, as well as the community of people experiencing homelessness. And when the city of Montreal was looking to redevelop the park a few years back, the Native Woman Shelter was hired to help lead consultation and research with people living and gathering in the park about strategies that would ensure park residents' safety without displacement. And this research resulted in the hiring of a full-time park-based social worker. So now this social worker is present in the park 5 days a week to provide a deeper level of support. And another sort of really interesting thing to note about this project is that because the Native Woman Shelter already had these established relationships in the park, at the start of COVID, they were able to really quickly pivot their programming to move their day center, which is called Resilience Montreal, outdoors into the park. So people were able to access counseling, food, and washrooms, all while maintaining physical distancing. And this idea of providing amenities and services in parks, like water and washrooms, etc., it's something that was really emphasized by all of the experts that we spoke with, and not just during COVID, but even before. And it's also recommended by the UN in their newly released National Protocol for Encampments in Canada, which just came out this spring. And then in addition to all of these expert recommendations, in our own survey of Canadians last month, we found that half of people want to see more washrooms in parks as part of COVID recovery, and 4 in 10 Canadians want to see better integration of services for people experiencing homelessness in parks. So we're already seeing a significant desire for change on this issue. Another area that we explore in the report is the importance of challenging stigma and facilitating relationship building between housed and unhoused park users to sort of learn how to better share space. So the current enforcement-based approach of clearing encampments tends to be driven by public complaints that are often rooted in stigma and a lack of complete understanding of homelessness. So there's a need to look for education and relationship building opportunities that can change perceptions and help to curb these complaints before they happen. And one example that we highlight in the report is the Roundhouse Cafe, which is also located in Montreal's Cabot Square. It's Montreal's first Indigenous cafe, and it's run out of a pavilion directly in the park. It employs Indigenous community members who are homeless or experiencing employment barriers, and offers flexible working arrangements. So this is not to suggest that employment is a one-size-fits-all solution, but this is just one example of how a model of park-based employment provides a source of income and also helps to break barriers and change perceptions. And we're also seeing a really amazing example right now of a community-organized effort to build connection in Strathcona Park in Vancouver. So Strathcona Park is home to a new and growing encampment of about 200 people. And last month, people living in the park organized a physically distant Meet Your Neighbors event, which featured a barbecue as well as music and speeches from park residents about why they're living in the park, with the goal of bringing together housed and unhoused neighbors to sort of create a foundation of mutual respect and understanding. And the encampment residents have also built a really respectful and reciprocal relationship with a community garden group based out of that park. So the garden group, for example, has given campers access to their hose to provide water for cooking, and they note that there have been fewer instances of people misusing the garden since campers moved in. And if and when any concerns arise around sharing that space, the gardeners and campers just arrange a meeting and sort of sort things out together. So it's really amazing to see what can come out of the simple act of talking with one another, but this is often overlooked.
Growth is another important theme in the report this year, especially as we deal with the fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic and creating a need for more and better public spaces, but also a need to better center issues of equity in park development and planning. So pressures from increased park use and tight budgets, these were all challenges that cities were facing and feeling prior to the pandemic that have only heightened since. In this year's report, we found the top 3 challenges identified by cities were keeping pace with growth, aging infrastructure, and insufficient operating budgets. But we saw less than 2/3 of cities reporting having a park system master plan in place that addressed growth that had been approved within the last 10 years. And those top challenges were pretty consistent with the top challenges that were listed last year. So these are ongoing issues. When we surveyed cities about COVID's impacts, as Adria already mentioned, 57% of cities said they expect COVID to negatively impact budgets in the next year. But half of cities also said that they had already reduced staffing levels for park maintenance and operations during COVID-19. So there's this kind of like push-pull happening right now where cities and people are reporting higher use of parks and kind of a greater appreciation of parks at the exact same time as we're seeing a lot of negative pressure on park budgets and some staffing reductions. So I think that's a real concern that could have long-lasting effects. And it's one that we certainly will be following, throughout the year, and I imagine will become a large part of next year's report. We also found in our COVID survey that 2/3 of Canadians said that they're more likely to visit a favorite local park in their neighborhood during COVID-19. And interestingly, when we dug a little bit deeper into the numbers, we found that people who said they don't have access to a park within 10 minutes were 5 times more likely to not use parks at all during COVID. So what this tells us really, again, is really the importance of having good quality parks that feel safe within walking distance, especially during COVID-19, where people are more likely to stay close to home and visit places that they already know near them. This is something I've done during this time is my circle of where I go is quite small in the last couple of months, and I've really appreciated the green spaces I have nearby, but I know that not everybody is as fortunate. We know many Canadian cities are struggling to have park development keep up with growth. Our data shows that many dense Canadian cities, Montreal, Vancouver, and Toronto, they show the lowest levels of parkland per population. And I think really what this highlights is the difficulty of having public space keep up with growing populations and urban development in some of our larger dense cities, especially in neighborhoods where there's just not a lot of land left in some areas to create new parks becomes quite challenging. So this is leading to a lot of cities, being more creative with how they build parks. But we also found through our research that these more creative parks are also more expensive to both build and to maintain. They're also more often involving partnerships between different landowners, between different government agencies, between community groups, to get things done. And all of this is adding to the complexity of park building and operations, but it's also leading to some really interesting parks. So we've heard about projects that put parks on top of things. So Langley Township's park that they're building on top of a water treatment facility, parks underneath things in Calgary. There's a park that's being built called Flyover Park that's underneath an overpass and was a design collaboration between students and a community group in the city. And parks along things like rail corridors or hydro corridors. So, Vancouver's Arbutus Greenway, and in Toronto, projects through hydro corridors like the Meadowway and the Green Line. But another project we highlight is the High Level Line in Edmonton, which is the image that you see on the screen. And this is a community-led project to use existing rail corridors and a rail bridge in the city to stitch together existing green spaces into a better network of parks. And so this is really showing us that cities are looking to use space efficiently, but also to better use the spaces that they already have in the spots where they may not be able to acquire new land by thinking more about connectivity. And we profile a number of other kind of connectivity related projects in the report. Waterloo's new Uptown strategy also has a number of connectivity public realm projects. But we also heard from experts that growth can't be the only metric used to decide where to invest in parks. Because one thing that the pandemic has really highlighted is the already present inequities in parks access and quality in our cities and between neighborhoods. So data collected in Montreal and Toronto have shown higher COVID infection rates in neighborhoods that are lower income or have higher proportions of Black residents and recent immigrants. Manaz Asani Kanji, who's our manager of outreach here at Park People, she pointed out that these neighborhoods are also the neighborhoods that she sees often having fewer park amenities and fewer opportunities for park programming than more affluent downtown communities. Manaz also pointed out that these pedestrianization projects and kind of the curbside cafes that many cities have done quickly in response to the pandemic, they may not necessarily be meeting the immediate needs of residents who are living in some of these neighborhoods outside of downtown. She said that, there in some of the outreach that she's been doing, she's heard, people telling her that what they need is actually more places to grow food in parks. And I think this is kind of an important point, that cities, need to take kind of a neighborhood-based approach to public space and park improvements and supports, especially during COVID, recognizing that each neighborhood, may require different supports and actions. So, maybe that's places to grow food, maybe it's places to access fresh food through like markets or something. It could be more space on streets to spill out. Could be washroom access, as Adrian mentioned, 50% of Canadians indicated they wanted more washrooms as part of COVID, more benches to allow people to spread out, more shade structures, or other services. One positive move that I think we've seen in the last year or so is that some cities have sort of stepped up with equity-based planning tools that help prioritize parks investment beyond just looking at kind of the metric of population growth and development. So Vancouver's new Van Play Master Plan, which was approved in 2019, for instance, includes mapping that layered on a few different metrics to understand which areas of the city are in need of parks investment, but might have been historically underinvested in. And that is the map that you see on the screen right now. So this will better help them target areas for investment beyond population and development growth only. And I think, now that these data tools are created, it would be really interesting to layer public health data from COVID-19 into a tool like this and see what that might tell us about where parks investments or programming may be needed. Unfortunately, we haven't seen tools like this in a lot of other cities. Toronto's just finalized parkland strategy in 2019, does have a similar tool. I think COVID-19 has taught us that we need to prioritize this type of equitable park development, which includes park programming and engagement supports, especially because of the major public health benefits that we've seen to mental and physical health for those who have these quality and safe parks nearby.
So those are the three main areas that we wanted to highlight for today, but of course there's much more in the report that we hope you'll explore. So if you haven't already, we encourage you to visit the website at cityparksreport.parkpeople.ca. And in terms of what's next for us, we will be continuing to provide new and updated content on the website around some of the themes we've discussed today and more. In particular, stay tuned in the next week or so for a new piece about homelessness and enforcement in parks during COVID. We'll also be diving deeper into the results of the COVID surveys that we conducted, and we'll share further analysis and learnings from those. And we're starting to think already about the 2021 report, so including new cities and focus areas, and in particular, as Jake mentioned, next year's report will be addressing the impacts of COVID in a more sort of comprehensive way. And again, as Jake mentioned, if your city wasn't featured in this year's report and you'd like to see it included, please do let us know. We also have a series of webinars planned throughout the summer to further explore specific themes and questions related to COVID that also tie in with some of the themes in the report. And we'll be convening panels featuring leading voices from across Canada on a variety of topics. So coming up first, we have a webinar called Open Streets or Equitable Cities, Who Gets to Write Urbanism's Next Chapter? And we also have one planned on creative solutions for the future of public engagement. Not included on the slide, but we're also partnering with the Canadian Parks Collective on a webinar for park leaders on August 6th about the role parks can play in addressing racial inequity in Canada. It'll be led by Rhiannon Curtin, who is co-founder of Black Birders Week and a champion for better representation of Black people in the outdoors. And we'll be welcoming a panel of Black Canadian scientists, naturalists, and outdoors people to discuss the steps that we might take toward making our park systems more inclusive. So thank you all so much for tuning in today, and we're really excited for you all to read the report and to hear your feedback and your questions during the discussion.
Thank you so much, Jake and Adri, for this amazing overview of such extensive research. We have now an opportunity for you to ask questions. So if you use, there's a Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we encourage you to type questions in there and we will address them as they come up. So I have a starting question for you about if you can speak to some of the standard measures or indices that could be used or perhaps need to be developed to help us compare successes and challenges in parks across Canada.
Right, I see this as a question from our friend John Mason at Friends of Guild Parks. So hi, John, thanks for joining. I hope that's kind of what we have started to do with this report, actually, we worked hard with, talking with city staff and refining the data, the definitions that we use for that data. It's very difficult to do cross comparisons across cities. That's something we've also learned over the last 2 years. There's so many differences between cities, not just size, but topography and climate that really impact different, levels of parkland or how, much a city needs to spend on maintaining parkland and things like that. So, I mean, take a look at the city profile section, and we hope that that has been the start of creating some of those standard park measures. There's other organizations out there. Yardstick is another one that has created a very comprehensive tool for collecting park data that some Canadian cities are a part of. And we collaborated with them on this and made sure that our definitions were aligned. The only other thing I'll say about that is that I think one of the interesting things for us about collecting comparative data, while I'm interested in hectares of parks and the budgets and things like that, I'm more interested in cross-comparing policies and procedures and programs. And that's why we really focused on that. In the report as well. So, how many cities have a policy to waive permit fees for groups? So it's not always just about numbers, I think. We need to look about what types of policies and programs are across the country.
Thank you, Jake. We have another question asking sort of the general trends of the responses. Did you see any trends related to either size or scale of cities or budgets, or whether they're more central, more rural, or any other trends that might have popped up across looking at data across the country?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. I think, one thing that has jumped out to us is as I mentioned in the presentation, the challenge for our sort of more dense urban cities and in providing parkland for their population. I mean, if you look at the chart that we have in the growth section for hectares of parkland per 1,000 people, you'll quickly notice that the cities that have 25 or 15 plus hectares per 1,000 people are more rural or smaller cities. So that's definitely a difference. Often those cities are also able to offer kind of more naturalized parkland as a percentage of their parkland. But it's a really good question. I think, that's something that we could do almost as a follow-up, is kind of dig a little bit deeper into some of those differences and maybe highlight that. So I really appreciate that question, Kate.
If you can also speak a little bit more in relation to equitable park development, what are some of the key areas where cities should be focusing their attention in working towards equity, especially during COVID recovery?
Oh, I just muted myself. Maybe I'll let Adri start with that one.
Sure. Well, I think coming back to some of the sort of recommendations that I was mentioning during the homelessness piece, I think definitely trying to get some basic amenities and services in parks, which will, things like washrooms, which will benefit everyone, as well as better services for some of our most vulnerable community members in parks, I think will be a really important area for cities to focus on. Jake, I don't know if you want to jump in with some of your other points on this.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot recently, and it's come up because of the the stat around 2/3 of people sticking kind of close to home, and kind of just my own experience right now during the pandemic is a renewed focus on local parks and neighborhood parks. I think there's often a lot of attention on kind of exciting new destination parks and big parks and things like that, and we definitely need those in our cities, but our local parks and neighborhood parks and the so-called kind of basic amenities of washrooms and shade structures and little gardens and things like that, I think people have a renewed understanding of the importance of having those nearby, and some of those sort of again, quote unquote basic amenities in parks. So I think that's something that I would like to see is a greater focus on the design and amenities in neighborhood parks as part of the sort of COVID recovery.
Thank you so much. So we have an interesting question about anything that you might have learned through your research with municipalities across the city about engaging newcomers, and could be partially as we have so much of a learning curve together as cities become more dense about how to share parks and public spaces, of how can we strategies that cities are using to sort of enhance our shared understanding of ways to use parks collaboratively for multiple different communities, different purposes, and people from different walks of life.
Yeah, in the report, in the collaboration section, there's a story on park engagement, and at the bottom there's a whole list of different things that cities are doing, and I think one of the things, if I remember correctly, is the city of Calgary using kind of their culture plan to create sort of culturally specific engagement activities, and I believe in 2020, and I hope this is still the case, that they're hiring folks who speak different dialects in order to get around some of the language barriers that people might have in terms of participating in engagement. This wasn't in this year's report, but it was in last year's report, and Adri, you might need to help me remember this a little bit, but I think some cities also had specific programming for newcomers as kind of welcome programming that included park tours and stuff. Do you remember that from last year? And if so, could you speak a little bit about it?
Yeah, in last year's report, we have a piece in the inclusion section called Parks as Places of Arrival that might be relevant or interesting for you to check out. And yeah, some of the initiatives that we saw in cities, I apologize, I'm not going to remember which cities they were in, but we saw park bus tours where newcomers could sign up to get a bus tour of major parks in the city to sort of get oriented and learn where those spaces are. And then we also sort of highlighted the work of Maybell Arts' program called Welcome to This Place, which included sort of arts and cultural focused programming to bring newcomers out into parks and help them discover new neighborhoods and things like that. So yeah, I would definitely check out the piece in the 2019 report.
So we have a fun thought experiment brought to the floor by Gil Peñalosa, asking hypothetically, if you had 1.5 billion, would you invest $1 million in 1,500 parks, 10 million in 150 parks, or 1,500 million in one park over the rail corridor? So starting to think about, if you, with a big chunk of money, how would you prioritize it in terms of bang for your buck?
This is one of those math problems, if Susan leaves the train station going at know, Gil, what you're talking about, and you're talking about Rail Duck Park in Toronto and whether it's a good idea to spend money right now on a park like that. I think, as I mentioned, around equitable park development, I would like to see a renewed focus on neighborhood parks. And so I think, to your question, I think we still need to think about growth, and certainly, the downtown of Toronto needs new park development. But if we're thinking about this from the perspective of, equitable park development, then I think we do need to think about, how to best spend the limited park funds that we have to ensure that we're creating equitable parks across the entire city. So I would go for more of the, for that approach at the moment.
Thank you, Jake. We have another interesting question asking about with aging demographics. Have you noticed any trends towards a greater incorporation of retrofitting for accessibility in parks in the few years of research over the Canada City Parks Report?
I believe the stat that we had this year was 80%, around 80% of cities said that there's been increasing demand for universal design and accessibility in parks. So I'll have to fact check that, but it was somewhere around there. So yes, definitely this is an area that cities are super interested in. And we actually have a piece in this year's report. It's called Accessibility Beyond Design. And it sort of looks at, on top of the very essential and necessary need for accessibility retrofits for physical accessibility, there are also some really interesting programs in place, both community-led and with city supported, to support various kinds of accessibility. So for example, we interviewed the head of Safari Walking Group in Toronto, which is a walking group for folks with blindness and vision loss. We also look at the work of the Canucks Autism Network in Vancouver, who they do some really interesting programming around sensory-friendly spaces at events. So yeah, for sure, this is an area that's trending that cities are thinking about, especially with aging populations, and not only in terms of the physical design, but also making things accessible through programming and other interventions.
The aspects of the research that you've done has really highlighted sort of the gap between the need and the desire to invest in our parks and the budgets. And we have a question wondering if you've seen any early signs of successes, how to mitigate this growing challenge.
Ooh, yeah, that's, it's, I think it's going to be a little, it's going to be a little rough. And it will really depend on, I would be watching what the federal and provincial government and the provincial governments across the country are doing in terms of sort of aid packages to cities that are really hurting right now. But I think one of the sort of advocacy tools that we have right now is, on the ones, we have a great recognition right now of the importance of parks by many different people across the country. If there was ever a moment when we all realized why parks are important to our lives, it's been, in the last couple of months. And so, that's a great base to build from in terms of building kind of a political and an advocacy constituency. So I think that's a positive thing, and the other thing that I would mention is I would also be highlighting the public health benefits of parks. There's obviously a great concern right now and interest in public health measures. And we've seen through, empirical research, but also through the surveys that we've done that parks are really important for people's mental and physical health. And so I would hope that we would see and be able to talk about parks as, part of kind of a public health strategy as part of COVID-19 recovery. I don't know if Adri wants to add anything, but those are my two thoughts.
Nothing to add.
That's amazing. Well, if we could add just maybe one little follow-up to that is that recognizing that the pots of money are going to be few and contained in terms of economic recovery for COVID, how do we make that argument for parks? as a tool for recovery for our communities and our cities across Canada.
We're talking about, this is Gil's question here. I'm just trying to read it as well. So are we talking about local economic development? Because I think, you know, the public health argument, you know, hopefully we have laid out a very strong case for that in the report this year. And I would, you know, so I would encourage people to read the Feel Good Factor article in the report on the website, but also go to that biodiversity resource library where there's lots of different resources around mental and physical health and nature as tools that you can use. In terms of, you know, other recovery, if I'm, you know, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is local economic development and, you know, the really tragic hit that many neighborhoods have taken in terms of stores and people losing jobs and their livelihoods. And one of the things that we talk about in the report, we did a really interesting interview with Cheyenne Sundance from Sundance Harvest. It's in an article in the Growth section called Towards Equitable Parks. And she talked about providing space in parks for urban agriculture and urban farming, not just as a way to address food security issues, but also as a way to start to talk about wealth generation in cities and use parks as, you know, tools for income generation, for skill building, networking. Unfortunately, a lot of cities have sort of bylaws or rules, policies against selling food grown in community gardens. And so she saw that as kind of like a barrier to something like that. But the other thing it could be, you know, and we've seen this in Toronto in a few different parks, is community groups kind of creating markets in parks to sell kind of like locally made goods. You know, nobody wants Nike shoes sold in parks, or, you know, to buy your mattress in the park, but, you know, local artisans and wares. You know, we already do that with farmers markets a bit. You know, could we expand that right now to give people access to different markets when maybe they lost their store or something like that? So I think there's so many different fronts right now where parks can be helpful, and we need to think a little bit outside of the box and bring, you know, new partners in. And so those are the things that come to mind there.
Thank you, Jake. I think we have time for one more question about the homelessness issue that you have addressed so well with your research. What advice would you give to how cities or community members might start to engage with consulting park users who are experiencing homelessness?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I would say for cities, I think a lot of the engagement that happens now, it tends to be outreach that's focused in a particular sort of one-way direction of like providing information about services that are available. But we know that a lot of times these services don't necessarily meet people's needs. Like, for example, in a city where there's no affordable housing available, it's hard for cities to really provide this information when the options just don't exist. So I think that I would like to see consultation and engagement that sort of goes the other way of asking, what do you need? Like, what can we do to work towards solutions that are actually gonna sort of be sustainable over the medium or longer term in terms of sharing the park space? Yeah, so just asking people what they need instead of telling them what's available, I think is a shift that I would really like to see happen on the city side. And then, yeah, in terms of like community members looking to engage with their unhoused neighbors, I think the most important thing to note is just to be respectful that that you're sort of in people's private space. So just making sure that your presence is welcome and that it's a good time to have a conversation is sort of like on a very practical level an important piece to keep in mind, since there's no real physical door to knock on. But yeah, I really hope that this engagement starts happening a little more frequently in Canadian cities. So thanks so much for the question.
Thank you both for all of your insights here and for providing this opportunity for people across the country to ask questions and dive a little deeper into all of this amazing research that you've done. And thank you to all of the attendees for your thoughtful questions. Before we part ways, we just wanted to make sure to direct you to the resources and also the research pages of the Park People website, where you can find dozens of other great park resources, from engaging at a community level to organizational and planning resources, case studies, and research papers. And we're including the link in the chat window, but you can find it right at the top panel of our webpage as well. We also encourage you to stay in touch. We put out a great monthly newsletter to keep you up to date on all upcoming opportunities, events, and research updates, and to provide you with information that you need to keep connected around the park issues that you care about. You can use the link in the chat window here to sign up. You can also just find it on our webpage. And we've also recently launched a fully bilingual national Facebook group that we encourage you to keep connected on with other park groups across the country. We would also like to thank all of our individual donors who support our continued work and efforts. If you would like to make a donation of any amount to Park People, you can just visit our website and do so there. So we thank you again all for joining us today and being part of the launch of this fantastic body of research. And we look forward to it guiding thoughtful development in park innovations in the years to come. So thank you, and do keep in touch. Be sure to connect with us on social media. And thank you again for joining, and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone. We really appreciate it.